Sabbath Church family. This dedicated space has been given as a platform to share further history on the Ponsonby Seventh-day Adventist Church in Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. Hallowed ground is the name given for this segment. We welcome you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit to this space. Our previous segment spoke to the early pioneers and their dedication and commitment to gather, worship and learn about the fundamentals of our beliefs, leading to the formation of our church and a covenant that is relevant today as it was in the initial formation. As this year marks 134 years of foundation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the Southern Hemisphere, it is only fitting we continue to share further narratives on the developments and history in a way that those who worship presently, some who remember these stories, and future generations are reminded of God's leading and purpose in our lives. With prayer and reverence, we continue this journey. The early church in Ponsonby were driven in their purpose to erect a church building within weeks of the tent meetings. The new light revealed to them excited the small group of believers, and they were stirred to share this light with others. They organised 2 committees, a site selection and a finance committee, each with 5 members. The generous giving of donations and pledges amounted to £115 to start the work. It is important to mention that the church was built by prospective members who were later baptised only after the completion of the church, which was then dedicated by Pastor A.G. Daniels on Sabbath, the 15th of October, 1887. The early church grew in number and also spread across the various mission fields within New Zealand, Australia, and the South Pacific Isles to plant, encourage, and support the gospel work. A few young men travelled to the Americas to be educated in theology and medicine. The early Sabbath keepers also recognised that there was much work to be done in their own backyard. On December the 22nd, 1901, a church building was held primarily for the purpose of instigating our very own church school. The hall at the rear of the church was transformed into a classroom. During the week, Miss Edith Ward, a recent graduate from Avondale in Australia, was called to be its first teacher. Records show that the school was opened on January 27th, 1902. Church historians Milton Hook notes that while local church members were responsible for the operation of schools, the problem of fees and teachers' wages was ongoing. School fees were 1 shilling per week, with Miss Ward earning 20 shillings. Generally, only single women attempted to live on such a mere income. Fees charged for the Ponsonby School proved insufficient to cover wages, and the decision was made to close the church on June the 20th, 1902, just 6 months after it opened. In that same month, the small congregation was also facing the challenge to upkeep and maintain the church property. As a result, it was decided to put the church up for sale. However, final settlement was never forthcoming. Throughout the years that followed, the membership at Ponsonby was declining as other churches operated in the Auckland suburbs. By 1953, another attempt to sell the church was discussed, but the members were still unwilling to move, despite the fact that the church was so badly in need of maintenance and her financial resources were exhausted. It was around this time that several Polynesian families were worshipping in the Fountain of Friendship Hall, Newton Road, Auckland. This venue was temporary as they were fundraising to purchase a permanent place to worship. With a dwindling membership at Ponsonby, together with the need for a place to worship, it was suggested that the group consider joining the Ponsonby Church. On May 28, 1955, a meeting was held and a vote taken by the Ponsonby Polynesian group to join and become active members of the Ponsonby Church. For those from the Pacific that would settle in Auckland, it was natural that they would attend the Ponsonby Church where their friends and family worshipped. As the members swelled, it was evident that the small, old historic church could no longer house the growing congregation. By 1957, head elder Carl Sorensen knew that they would need to build a bigger church, and he looked at buying the properties next to the existing church on McKelvey Street and directly behind the church facing onto Scanlon Street. The following is an account as recorded by Carl Sorensen. A little old lady, Mary Penny, who had lived directly behind the church at 59 Scanlon Street, remembered seeing the original church built in McKelvey Street in 1887, and as a young girl used to stand at her back fence and listen to the singing and music coming from the church. She offered to swap her house for a similar property in Grey Lynn so that the church could have her property. This was done on 25th of September 1962, and another home was purchased for her for £3,000. Mrs. Coots lived next to the church in McKelvey Street. She not only owned her house, but also owned the section behind it, which was accessed by a right-of-way and leased to a panel beater. He had tried to buy the land he leased, but she refused to sell to him. However, when approached by the church, she offered to sell for £4,000. A £300 deposit was paid in faith, as the church did not have the full purchase price, and Mrs. Coots gave a £250 donation back to the church. The panel beater moved out after it explained to him that the land was to be used for building a new church. Mrs. Coots died of cancer just 2 months later. When the Ponsonby Church applied to the Auckland City Council for a building permit, they could not get one. The conference president, Pastor Stokes, advised Ponsonby to move out of the city because, as well as not getting the building permit, they still had to pay off the second property by instalments. Carl did not believe they should leave the Ponsonby area, otherwise the Lord would have shown his leading in the purchase of the two properties. Frederick Biddy, the owner of the adjacent property at 61 Scanlon Street, directly behind the panel beater, offered his house for sale for £4,000. Pastor Stokes again said sell because you have no money. But Carl still felt that the Lord was leading and wanted the church to stay in Ponsonby. The owner was happy to take a deposit and monthly repayments. Pastor John Howes, Carl Sorensen, Richard Masters, Herbert Roberts, and Robert Ramoni formed a trust and bought the property. After the property was signed over, the City Council issued the building permit. The adjoining property at 63 Scanlon Street, directly behind the panel beater's business, was also acquired from Sifa Jules and Laura Richardson on February the 8th, 1973, with the intention of building a youth hall and activities centre. On the 6th of November 1966, the new Ponsonby Church was opened with a membership of about 400. The old church was kept as a hall and joins on to the new church. An experienced Pacific Islands missionary, Pastor John T. Howes, was the church pastor, and Pastor Hollingsworth, the conference president. Incidentally, the grandmother of Pastor Howes was Mrs. Mary Boucher Hill, who attended A.G. Daniels' mission and was one of the first candidates to be baptized in the original church in 1887. My mother, Agnes Rungel, previously known as Agnes Staline, and her family lived next door to Pastor House Sr. and his family growing up in Samoa. It was through their association that my grandparents, Eddie and Louisa Staline, and their family became Seventh-day Adventists. When my mother migrated to New Zealand, she also worshipped in the Fountain of Friendship hall and then moved with these believers to the Ponsonby Seventh-day Adventist Church. My mum had fond memories of her time worshipping in this hall. I remember Pastor John Howes, Carl Sorensen, Richard Masters, Herbert Roberts and Robert Ramoni as our families worshipped in this church together. This part of history is new to me, as it may be for some of you. In closing, to be living through a pandemic and to pause in respect of the sacred history of this church enables us to fully appreciate and be mindful of our own purpose and God's plan for each of our lives. As we respectfully share these stories and history, we are privileged to hear these accounts and more deeply understand the sheer determination and strength required to uphold and maintain the legacy of these men and women of God. We are therefore reminded, to the glory of God, we, the undersigned, hereby associate ourselves together as a church, taking the name Seventh-day Adventist and covenanting to keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Thank you, everyone, for your presence and kind attention at this time. Amen.